Captain Sarah Martinez had dreamed of flying since she was 7 years old, watching fighter jets streak across the desert sky near her home in Arizona. 20 years later, she stood on the tarmac at Edwards Air Force Base, staring at the sleek, experimental F-12 aircraft that represented everything she had worked for. The morning sun reflected off its polished metal surface, and she could almost feel the power contained within its frame. Sarah's journey to this moment had been anything but easy. Growing up as the daughter of a mechanic and a school teacher, she had clawed her way through the Air Force Academy, graduating third in her class despite facing constant doubt from instructors who questioned whether women belonged in combat roles. She had proven herself time and again, flying transport missions in hostile territories, earning commendations for her precision and calm under pressure. The F-12 project was classified at the highest levels. Only a select few pilots had been chosen to test the revolutionary aircraft, which featured technology that could change the future of air warfare. Sarah had spent months studying every technical manual, memorizing flight procedures, and undergoing grueling physical and psychological evaluations. Her scores were perfect. Her recommendations were glowing. On paper, she was the ideal candidate. But as she approached the hangar that morning, she noticed the strange looks from the ground crew. Whispered conversations stopped when she passed. Major Thompson, the flight operations coordinator, avoided eye contact when she checked in. Something was wrong, and Sarah could feel the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. The briefing room was filled with the usual suspects, test pilots, engineers, and military brass. Colonel Hayes, the project director, stood at the front with a grim expression. Sarah took her seat among the other pilots, all men, and waited for the day's assignments to be announced. Her name should have been at the top of the list. She had been scheduled for weeks. Colonel Hayes cleared his throat and began reading the flight roster. One by one, he called out names and aircraft assignments. Sarah waited, her heart pounding with anticipation. But as the list grew shorter, her name never came. When Hayes finished, Sarah remained the only pilot without an assignment. She raised her hand, her voice steady despite the confusion churning in her stomach. "Sir, I believe there's been an oversight. I'm scheduled to fly the F-12 today." The room fell silent. Several pilots turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from sympathy to embarrassment. Colonel Hayes shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight. "Captain Martinez," he said slowly, "there's been a change of plans. We've decided to delay your evaluation pending further review." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Further review? She had passed every test, met every requirement. Her record was spotless. The only thing that had changed was the politics surrounding women in combat roles. The room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Sarah felt her face burning with humiliation and anger, but she kept her composure. She had learned long ago that showing emotion would only give her critics ammunition. "May I ask what specific concerns need to be addressed, sir?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. Colonel Hayes avoided her gaze. "There are questions about the physical demands of the F-12. The G-forces involved are significant. We need to ensure all safety protocols are met." It was a weak excuse, and everyone in the room knew it. Sarah had flown aircraft with similar G-force requirements. She had undergone the same physical testing as her male counterparts and had often outperformed them. Major Thompson stood up, his face red with what looked like embarrassment. "Sir, with respect, Captain Martinez has met all the requirements. Her test scores are among the highest we've seen. I don't understand the basis for this delay." Other voices joined in, some supporting Sarah, others remaining conspicuously silent. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah realized that this moment would define not just her career, but potentially the future of women in military aviation. The F-12 project was high-profile enough that news of discrimination would reach the highest levels of the Pentagon. But she also knew that making a scene could backfire, giving her opponents exactly what they needed to justify their position. Colonel Hayes raised his hand for silence. "The decision has been made. Captain Martinez will remain on standby, pending further evaluation." That's final. Sarah felt her dreams slipping away, but she refused to give up. She had come too far and sacrificed too much to let politics and prejudice win now. As the meeting disbanded, Sarah remained in her seat, her mind racing. She thought about her father, who had taught her that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. She thought about her younger sister, who looked up to her as a role model. Most importantly, she thought about all the young girls who might follow in her footsteps, if she could just find a way to break down this barrier. The hangar grew quiet as the other pilots headed to their aircraft. Sarah walked slowly to the observation deck, where she could watch the F-12 being prepared for flight. The ground crew worked with practiced efficiency, checking systems, and running diagnostics. In a few hours, another pilot would experience the thrill she had dreamed of her entire life. But Sarah Martinez wasn't ready to give up. She had an idea, a long shot that might just work. There was one person on the base with enough authority to override Colonel Hayes, someone who had a reputation for fairness and supporting talented officers regardless of gender. If she could just get 5 minutes with General Morrison, she might have a chance to salvage her career and prove that women belonged in the cockpit of America's most advanced fighter aircraft. General Morrison was a legend at Edwards Air Force Base. At 62, he had flown combat missions in 3 different conflicts and had personally tested dozens of experimental aircraft during his career. His office walls were covered with photographs of him standing beside various military aircraft, from early jet fighters to the most sophisticated planes in the American arsenal. More importantly, he had a reputation as someone who judged people by their abilities, not their background or gender. Sarah knew that approaching the general directly was a risky move that could backfire spectacularly. Military protocol demanded that she work through the proper chain of command, which meant going back to Colonel Hayes, the same man who had just grounded her without cause. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and Sarah had learned that sometimes breaking a few rules was necessary to fight a greater injustice. She spent the rest of the morning gathering documentation to support her case. Her personnel file was thick with commendations and positive evaluations. Her flight test scores were consistently in the top 5%. Her physical fitness ratings exceeded the requirements for F-12 pilots. Most convincingly, she had video footage from her simulator runs that showed her handling the aircraft's systems with remarkable skill and composure. At precisely 1,400 hours, Sarah knocked on General Morrison's door. His aide, a young lieutenant, looked surprised to see her. "Captain Martinez, do you have an appointment with the general?" Sarah straightened her shoulders and looked the lieutenant in the eye. "No, but I need to speak with him about the F-12 program. It's urgent." The lieutenant disappeared into the inner office, and Sarah could hear muffled voices through the door. After what felt like an eternity, he returned. "The general will see you for 5 minutes, Captain. Make it count." Sarah nodded, gathered her materials, and walked into the office that could determine her future. General Morrison looked up from a stack of reports, his steel gray eyes studying Sarah with the intensity of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. "Captain Martinez, I understand you wanted to discuss the F-12 program. I hope you have something important to tell me, because I have a very full schedule today." Sarah placed her documentation on the general's desk and stood at attention. "Sir, I believe there has been a serious error in the evaluation process for F-12 test pilots. I have been removed from the flight roster without cause, despite meeting or exceeding all requirements." She kept her voice professional and factual, knowing that emotion would undermine her credibility. The general picked up her file and began scanning through the pages. His expression remained neutral, but Sarah noticed his eyebrows raised slightly when he reached her test scores. "These are impressive numbers, Captain. Walk me through what happened this morning." Sarah recounted the briefing, Colonel Hayes' announcement, and the weak justification he had provided. She was careful to stick to facts and avoid accusations, but the unfairness of the situation was obvious. General Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a pad beside his computer. When she finished, the general leaned back in his chair. "Captain, you understand that test pilot assignments are made based on numerous factors, not just raw scores. There are political considerations, safety concerns, and program objectives that might not be apparent to individual pilots." Sarah felt her heart sink, thinking he was about to dismiss her concerns with the same bureaucratic language she had heard from Hayes. But then, Morrison's expression hardened. However, I also understand that this program's success depends on having the best pilots available, regardless of any other considerations. And, from what I'm seeing in your file, you appear to be one of the best. He stood up and walked to his window, which provided a clear view of the flight line where the F-12 sat waiting. I've been in the military for 40 years, Captain Martinez. I've seen talented people held back for reasons that had nothing to do with their abilities. I've also seen what happens when we let politics override merit. People die, missions fail, and our country becomes less safe. He turned back to face Sarah, his expression serious but not unsympathetic. Tell me honestly, Captain, are you prepared for the possibility that flying the F-12 could end your career if something goes wrong? There are powerful people who would love to use any mistake you make as proof that women don't belong in advanced combat aircraft. The pressure on you will be enormous, and the margin for error will be zero. Sarah had thought about this question countless times during her career. Every flight, every evaluation, every interaction with male colleagues carried the weight of representing all women in the military. It was an unfair burden, but one she had learned to carry. Sir, I've been flying with that pressure my entire career. If I can't handle it, then I don't belong in the cockpit regardless of my gender. But if I can prove myself, then maybe the next woman won't have to face the same obstacles. General Morrison studied her for a long moment, and Sarah could practically see him weighing the risks and benefits of supporting her. The F-12 program was too important to become embroiled in controversy, but it was also too important to exclude qualified pilots based on prejudice. Finally, the general picked up his phone. "Get me Colonel Hayes in my office immediately," he said to his aide. Then, he looked at Sarah. "Captain, you're going to get your chance to fly that aircraft. But, understand this, you'll be under more scrutiny than any test pilot in history. Every move you make will be analyzed and criticized. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. "Yes, sir. I've been ready my whole life." When Colonel Hayes arrived a few minutes later, his face was flushed and his jaw was clenched. He had clearly been expecting this confrontation, but that didn't make it any easier. General Morrison wasted no time with pleasantries. "Colonel, I've been reviewing the F-12 pilot assignments, and I have some concerns about your decision-making process. Specifically, I'm wondering why Captain Martinez was removed from today's flight roster despite having the qualifications and schedule priority." Hayes shifted uncomfortably, clearly searching for a response that would satisfy the general without admitting to discrimination. "Sir, there were concerns about the physical demands of the aircraft. We wanted to conduct additional evaluations to ensure safety standards were met." It was the same weak excuse he had used in the morning briefing, and General Morrison's expression showed exactly what he thought of it. The general opened Sarah's file and began reading from her physical fitness reports. Every score was well above the minimum requirements. Her G-force tolerance test showed she could handle more stress than several of the male pilots currently cleared for F-12 flights. When he finished reading, he looked up at Hayes with barely concealed irritation. "Colonel, these scores suggest that Captain Martinez is physically more than capable of handling the F-12. Unless you have specific evidence of a problem that I'm not seeing, I'm having difficulty understanding the basis for your decision." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Sarah watched as Colonel Hayes struggled to find a response that wouldn't expose his real motivations. She could see the conflict playing out on his face, the desire to maintain his position versus the knowledge that he was on thin ice with the general. Finally, Hayes straightened his shoulders and made what Sarah realized was a calculated decision. "Sir, there have been concerns raised by some members of the program about the potential impact on unit cohesion. The F-12 project is critical to national security, and we can't afford any distractions or complications." It was the wrong thing to say. General Morrison's face darkened, and Sarah could feel the temperature in the room drop several degrees. The general had just been given a clear admission that the decision was based on gender rather than merit, and his response would determine not just Sarah's fate, but the future of women in military aviation. General Morrison stood perfectly still for several seconds after Colonel Hayes' admission, and Sarah could practically see the anger building behind his controlled expression. The silence in the office was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of aircraft engines from the flight line. When the general finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded thousands of troops in combat. Colonel Hayes, in my 4 decades of military service, I have never heard a more unprofessional justification for excluding a qualified officer from duty. You are telling me that you have allowed the personal prejudices of other personnel to override the merit-based assignment system that is fundamental to military effectiveness. Each word was delivered with surgical precision, and Hayes visibly flinched. Sarah remained at attention, but inside she felt a mixture of vindication and nervousness. She was witnessing a confrontation between 2 senior officers that could reshape the entire program, and she was at the center of it. The general continued, his voice growing harder with each sentence. Let me be absolutely clear about something, Colonel. The United States military is not a social club where people get to choose their colleagues based on personal comfort. It is a fighting force that depends on utilizing the best talent available, regardless of gender, race, or any other irrelevant characteristic. When you allow unit cohesion concerns to override merit, you make our military weaker and less capable. Hayes tried to interrupt, but General Morrison held up his hand. I'm not finished. You have potentially compromised a critical defense program by allowing politics to influence operational decisions. More importantly, you have violated the fundamental principle that all service members should be judged by their performance, not their demographics. The general walked to his desk and picked up Sarah's personnel file again. Captain Martinez has scores that place her in the top 5% of all test pilots. Her flight experience includes combat missions and emergency situations that would challenge any pilot. Her physical fitness ratings exceed the requirements for F-12 operations. Yet you excluded her because some people might be uncomfortable working with a woman? Sarah watched Hayes struggle to respond. His face was red, and she could see beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the air conditioning. He was clearly realizing that his career might be in jeopardy, but he seemed determined to defend his position. Sir, the F-12 program is too important to risk on social experiments. We need proven performers, not diversity initiatives. It was perhaps the worst thing Hayes could have said, and Sarah saw the general's eyes flash with fury. Social experiments? Morrison's voice dropped to just above a whisper, which somehow made it more intimidating than shouting would have been. Colonel, Captain Martinez has more combat flying hours than half the pilots currently assigned to this program. She has faced enemy fire, handled emergency situations, and consistently demonstrated the skills we need in our test pilots. If you consider her a social experiment, then you clearly don't understand what makes a good pilot. The general moved to stand directly in front of Hayes, and Sarah could see that despite Morrison being shorter than the colonel, there was no question about who held the authority in the room. Let me ask you something, Colonel. When you're in a combat situation and need air support, do you care if the pilot saving your life is male or female? Or do you care whether they're skilled enough to complete the mission successfully? Hayes mumbled something that might have been agreement, but General Morrison wasn't finished. I flew missions with some of the finest pilots this country has ever produced, and some of them happened to be women. They saved my life more than once, and they did it not because of their gender, but despite having to overcome the kind of prejudice you're displaying right now. Sarah felt a surge of respect for the general. She had heard stories about his combat experience, but seeing him defend the principle of merit-based assignments with such passion was inspiring. More importantly, she could see that his support wasn't based on sympathy or political correctness, but on a genuine belief in military effectiveness. Furthermore, the general continued, I find it interesting that these unit cohesion concerns have never been raised about Captain Martinez before. Her previous assignments have included working with male pilots and ground crews, and I don't see any negative evaluations or complaints in her record. Perhaps the problem isn't with her integration into the unit, but with certain individuals' ability to maintain professional standards. Hayes was clearly struggling to maintain his composure, but he made one final attempt to salvage his position. Sir, the stakes with the F-12 are higher than anything Captain Martinez has flown before. The aircraft represents billions of dollars in development costs and technology that could determine the future of air superiority. We can't afford any mistakes. General Morrison nodded slowly, and for a moment Sarah worried that Hayes might have found an argument that would resonate. But then the general smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. You're absolutely right, Colonel. We can't afford any mistakes. That's exactly why we need our best pilots flying that aircraft, regardless of any other considerations. The general walked back to his desk and pulled out a scheduling sheet. Captain Martinez will fly the F-12 tomorrow morning at 0800 hours. She will be given full access to all preparation materials and technical briefings. Any member of the ground crew or support staff who has concerns about working with her can request a transfer to another program immediately. Hayes opened his mouth to protest, but Morrison cut him off with a look. This decision is final, Colonel. Captain Martinez has earned this opportunity through her performance and qualifications. If you have concerns about her abilities, then document them properly and submit them through official channels. But gut feelings and social concerns are not valid reasons to exclude qualified personnel from critical missions. Sarah felt her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She was finally getting her chance, but the pressure would be enormous. Every aspect of her performance would be scrutinized, and any mistake would be magnified beyond all proportion. But she had been preparing for this moment her entire career, and she was determined to prove that women belonged in the cockpit of America's most advanced fighter aircraft. The general turned to address Sarah directly. Captain, you have 24 hours to prepare for what may be the most important flight of your career. I suggest you use that time wisely. Review the technical manuals, study the flight procedures, and get a good night's sleep. Tomorrow morning, you'll have the opportunity to demonstrate that merit is the only criterion that matters in military aviation. Sarah snapped to attention. Yes, sir. Thank you for this opportunity. I won't let you down. General Morrison studied her for a moment, then nodded approvingly. I don't expect you to be perfect, Captain. I expect you to be professional, prepared, and focused on the mission. If you do those things, the results will speak for themselves. He paused, then added, and Captain, remember that you're not just flying for yourself tomorrow. You're flying for every qualified person who has ever been excluded from an opportunity they deserved. As Hayes and Sarah prepared to leave the office, General Morrison had one final message for the colonel. Colonel Hayes, I want a full briefing on program protocols and assignment procedures first thing tomorrow morning. It's time we ensure that all decisions in this program are based on objective criteria rather than subjective preferences. Walking out of the general's office, Sarah felt as if she were floating on air. She had her chance at last, but now came the hard part, proving that she deserved it. The next 24 hours would determine not just her career, but potentially the future of women in military aviation. Sarah spent the evening in the technical library, poring over every manual, specification sheet, and maintenance report related to the F-12. The aircraft was unlike anything she had ever flown, a hybrid of experimental technology and proven aerodynamics that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in military aviation. Its engines could generate thrust levels that would pin a pilot to their seat, while its avionics systems were so advanced they seemed like something from science fiction. She had flown the F-12 simulator dozens of times, but she knew that nothing could truly prepare her for the real thing. The actual aircraft would respond differently, feel different, and present challenges that no computer program could fully replicate. Every pilot who had flown it described the experience as both exhilarating and terrifying, requiring split-second decisions and absolute precision. As she studied the Emergency Procedures Manual, Sarah was joined by Captain Mike Rodriguez, one of the few pilots who had already completed F-12 test flights. Mike was known for his technical expertise and fair-minded approach to fellow pilots. He sat down across from her with his own stack of manuals. Heard about tomorrow, he said quietly, keeping his voice low in the library setting. Want some advice from someone who's been there? Sarah looked up gratefully. She had been wondering if any of the other pilots would be willing to help her, or if they would distance themselves from what had become a controversial situation. I'd appreciate any insights you can share, Sarah replied. Mike opened his flight log and showed her detailed notes from his F-12 experiences. For the next 2 hours, he walked her through the subtle differences between simulator and reality, the quirks of the aircraft's systems, and the psychological challenges of flying such an advanced machine. The power is incredible, Mike explained. When those engines spool up to full thrust, you'll feel forces unlike anything you've experienced. But the real challenge is mental. The aircraft is so capable that it's easy to get overconfident. Respect the machine, trust your training, and don't try to prove anything beyond your normal skills. Sarah appreciated his practical advice, but she could also hear the underlying message that she would be under enormous pressure to perform flawlessly. How do you handle the stress of knowing that everyone is watching your every move? She asked. Mike smiled. Same way you handle any flight. You prepare thoroughly, follow procedures, and focus on the mission. The only difference is that your mission tomorrow isn't just to test the aircraft. It's to prove that assignments should be based on merit rather than politics. He paused, then added, For what it's worth, I think you're more than qualified for this flight. Your simulator scores were better than mine when I started. The validation from a respected colleague meant more to Sarah than she could express. As they packed up their materials, Mike offered one final piece of advice. Remember, the aircraft doesn't care about your gender, your background, or anyone's opinions. It only responds to skill, preparation, and confidence. If you've got those things, and I believe you do, then everything else is just noise. Sarah slept better that night than she had expected, though she woke up several times thinking about flight procedures and emergency protocols. At 0500 hours, she was up and preparing for what could be the most important day of her career. Her pre-flight routine was meticulous, reviewing weather conditions, studying the flight plan, and checking every system specification one final time. The sunrise over Edwards Air Force Base painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink as Sarah walked to the hangar. The F-12 sat in its designated bay, surrounded by ground crew members performing final checks and preparations. The aircraft looked even more impressive in the dawn light, its sleek lines and polished surfaces reflecting the morning sun. Chief Master Sergeant Williams, the senior enlisted member of the ground crew, approached Sarah with a clipboard full of inspection reports. Williams was a 20-year veteran who had worked on every type of aircraft in the Air Force inventory. His reputation for thoroughness and attention to detail was legendary among pilots. Morning, Captain, Williams said with professional courtesy. Aircraft is ready for flight. All systems green. Pre-flight inspection completed with no discrepancies noted. He handed her the clipboard, and Sarah noticed that his crew had been even more meticulous than usual. Every system had been checked and double-checked, every component inspected with extraordinary care. As Sarah reviewed the paperwork, other pilots began gathering near the hangar. Some were there for their own scheduled flights, but she noticed several who had no official reason to be present. Word had clearly spread about her flight, and people wanted to witness what could be a historic moment in military aviation. Colonel Hayes appeared at precisely 0730 hours, his expression carefully neutral. Sarah could see that he was still unhappy about being overruled by General Morrison, but he was maintaining professional standards. Captain Martinez, ready for your briefing? He asked, his voice clipped but correct. The briefing room was more crowded than usual, with engineers, technicians, and observers filling every available seat. Sarah took her position at the front table while Colonel Hayes reviewed the flight objectives and parameters. The mission was relatively straightforward, a series of performance tests designed to evaluate the aircraft's handling characteristics at various speeds and altitudes. Flight duration approximately 90 minutes, Hayes continued. Test points include subsonic handling, supersonic acceleration, high-G maneuvering, and landing approach characteristics. Safety chase aircraft will maintain visual contact throughout the flight. Sarah noted that the test plan was identical to what other pilots had flown, with no additional restrictions or limitations imposed on her flight. Dr. Jennifer Chun, the chief aerospace engineer for the F-12 program, stood up to review the technical aspects of the test flight. Captain Martinez, we're particularly interested in your assessment of the aircraft's stability during high-speed maneuvers. Previous pilots have reported some interesting characteristics that we'd like to understand better. Sarah felt honored to be contributing to the aircraft's development, but she also understood the subtext. Her technical observations would be scrutinized not just for their accuracy, but as evidence of her competence as a test pilot. Every comment she made would need to be precise, professional, and valuable to the engineering team. As the briefing concluded, General Morrison entered the room. His presence immediately raised the tension level, and Sarah could see several people straightening in their seats. The general took a position at the back of the room, but his message was clear. This flight had his personal attention and support. "Captain Martinez," General Morrison said, "the flight is yours. Execute the test plan professionally, document your observations accurately, and demonstrate the flying skills that earned you this assignment." His words were simple, but Sarah could hear the underlying confidence in her abilities. Walking to the aircraft, Sarah felt the weight of history on her shoulders. She thought about all the women who had dreamed of moments like this, all the barriers that had been broken by those who came before her, and all the young girls who might be inspired by what happened in the next few hours. The ground crew helped her into the cockpit, checking her harness and helmet connections with extra care. Chief Williams personally verified every switch position and system setting, ensuring that nothing had been overlooked. "Good luck, Captain," he said as he prepared to remove the boarding ladder. "Bring her back safe." Sarah began her pre-flight checklist, methodically working through dozens of procedures that had become second nature through years of training. The F-12's cockpit was a marvel of engineering, with displays and controls that represented the cutting edge of aviation technology. But, despite its sophistication, the basic principles remained the same. Understand your aircraft, respect its capabilities, and never forget that flying was both a privilege and a responsibility. As the engine spooled up for the first time, Sarah felt the awesome power of the F-12 vibrating through the airframe. This was it, the moment she had worked toward her entire career. In a few minutes, she would prove that merit, not gender, was what mattered in the cockpit of America's most advanced fighter aircraft. The F-12's engines reached full power with a sound unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. The aircraft seemed to come alive beneath her, every system humming with barely contained energy. She completed her final systems checks, received clearance from the control tower, and began her taxi to the runway. Through her headset, she could hear the calm professionalism of the air traffic controllers, but she knew that dozens of people were watching her every move. As she lined up on the runway centerline, Sarah took a deep breath and focused on the task ahead. This was just another flight, she told herself, despite knowing that everything about it was extraordinary. The chase aircraft reported ready, the control tower gave final clearance, and Sarah advanced the throttles for takeoff. The acceleration was incredible. Within seconds, the F-12 was moving faster than Sarah had ever experienced during a ground roll. The runway markers flashed past in a blur, and then she was airborne, climbing at a rate that pressed her deep into her ejection seat. The aircraft felt alive in her hands, responding to every input with precision and power that was almost overwhelming. Edwards Tower, Falcon 01 airborne, climbing to flight level 200 for initial test points, Sarah reported, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The response came back immediately, professional and supportive. "Roger, Falcon 01, contact approach control on 124.7. Good luck." The first test points went smoothly. Sarah evaluated the aircraft's handling characteristics at various speeds and configurations, carefully noting her observations for the engineering team. The F-12 responded beautifully to her inputs, its flight control systems working seamlessly to maintain stability and precision. Her simulator training had been excellent preparation, but nothing had quite captured the sheer power and capability of the real aircraft. Falcon 01, beginning supersonic acceleration, Sarah announced as she pushed the throttles forward. The aircraft leaped ahead, quickly passing through the sound barrier with barely a tremor. The acceleration continued, and Sarah found herself flying faster than she had ever gone before, the desert landscape far below rushing past at incredible speed. It was during the high-G maneuvering tests that the F-12 revealed its true character. Sarah pulled the aircraft into a series of tight turns, feeling forces that would have overwhelmed lesser machines. The aircraft remained rock-stable throughout the maneuvers, its advanced flight control systems automatically adjusting to maintain optimal performance. Sarah's physical conditioning and G-suit allowed her to remain focused and alert despite the tremendous forces involved. Outstanding performance characteristics, she reported to the ground control team. Aircraft remained stable and responsive throughout the test envelope. No unexpected behaviors observed. The relief in the voices that responded was obvious. The flight was going perfectly, and Sarah was providing exactly the kind of professional evaluation that the program needed. But it was during the final test sequence that something unexpected happened. As Sarah began her descent for landing approach evaluation, one of the F-12's primary hydraulic systems began showing anomalous readings. The warning lights on her instrument panel indicated a serious problem that could potentially affect the aircraft's controllability. Edwards control, Falcon 01 showing hydraulic system irregularities. Requesting guidance for emergency procedures, Sarah reported, her voice calm despite the seriousness of the situation. The response was immediate. Emergency crews were being dispatched, and the chase aircraft moved in for closer observation of the F-12's condition. Sarah ran through the emergency checklists with methodical precision, working to isolate the problem and maintain aircraft control. The F-12's backup systems were functioning properly, but the loss of primary hydraulics meant that landing would require exceptional skill and careful planning. She had trained for this scenario countless times in the simulator, but doing it in real life with everyone watching added tremendous pressure. Falcon 01, this is General Morrison, came a voice through her headset. The general had taken personal control of the radio communication, and Sarah could hear the concern in his voice. What's your assessment of the situation, Captain? Sir, I have backup hydraulic systems operational and maintain full control authority. Request vectors for straight-in approach to runway 22. Aircraft handling remains normal despite the system anomaly. Sarah's response was textbook perfect, professional, accurate, and confident without being overconfident. General Morrison's next transmission contained the 4 words that would become legendary at Edwards Air Force Base. Martinez, bring her home. Those simple words conveyed absolute confidence in Sarah's abilities and marked the moment when her gender became irrelevant compared to her skills as a pilot. The approach and landing were flawless. Sarah brought the F-12 down with the precision of a surgeon, touching down exactly on the runway centerline despite the hydraulic issues. Emergency crews stood ready, but their services weren't needed. The aircraft rolled to a stop normally, and Sarah shut down the engines with a sense of accomplishment that was almost overwhelming. As she climbed out of the cockpit, Sarah was greeted by cheers from the ground crew and technicians who had witnessed her performance. Chief Williams was the first to reach her, his weathered face split by an enormous grin. Outstanding flying, Captain. That was as good as it gets. Other crew members gathered around, offering congratulations and expressing genuine respect for her skills. Colonel Hayes approached with what appeared to be a mixture of embarrassment and admiration. Captain Martinez, that was exceptional flying under difficult circumstances. Your handling of the emergency was textbook perfect. Sarah could see that his attitude toward her had fundamentally changed. She was no longer a female pilot to him, but simply an outstanding pilot who happened to be female. General Morrison arrived at the aircraft within minutes, and Sarah could see the pride and satisfaction on his face. Captain, that was one of the finest displays of piloting skill I've seen in 40 years of military aviation. You've proven beyond any doubt that assignments should be based on merit alone. The debrief session that followed was thorough and professional. Sarah's technical observations were detailed and valuable, helping the engineering team understand several important characteristics of the F-12's performance envelope. Her handling of the hydraulic emergency had provided crucial data about the aircraft's backup systems and emergency procedures. Dr. Chun was particularly complimentary about Sarah's technical reporting. Captain Martinez's observations are among the most detailed and useful we've received from any test pilot. Her engineering background clearly enhanced her ability to analyze and communicate the aircraft's behavior. As word of the successful flight spread throughout Edwards Air Force Base, Sarah began to understand the broader impact of what had happened. She had not only proven her own qualifications, but had struck a blow for merit-based assignments throughout the military. The F-12 program would continue with a new understanding that the best pilots, regardless of gender, were essential for success. In the weeks that followed, Sarah became the lead test pilot for several F-12 evaluation projects. Her expertise with the aircraft and her ability to handle complex situations made her invaluable to the program. More importantly, her success opened doors for other qualified women who had been waiting for their own opportunities to prove themselves. Years later, when Sarah had risen to the rank of Brigadier General and was commanding her own test wing, she would still remember General Morrison's 4 words, "Martinez, bring her home." They had marked the moment when her gender stopped being a factor in her career and her abilities became the only measure that mattered. The F-12 program went on to revolutionize military aviation, and Sarah's contributions were recognized as essential to its success. But, perhaps more importantly, her flight that day helped establish the principle that America's military would utilize the best talent available, regardless of any factors other than merit and qualifications. Sarah Martinez had dreamed of flying since she was 7 years old. On that morning at Edwards Air Force Base, she had not only achieved her dream, but had helped make it possible for countless others to pursue theirs. The sky, she had proven, belonged to anyone with the skill and determination to claim it.